Hello, everyone, and welcome this week to the Grace Alone podcast. We're kind of a little different than we usually do this week. We're going to kind of do an episode. I want to been doing this for a while, kind of where I just basically have a bunch of random questions, just kind of like a rapid fire thing here. And but we do have a special guest with us because I usually don't like to do my podcast episodes alone. It's just fun to kind of bounce off different people. So, would the guest please introduce himself?
Hey, so my name is Sean Carney from Little Rock, Arkansas. So I just graduated in May from Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary with a master's in theological studies and an emphasis in historical theology. Thank God we're done. It was a long 5 years, but we did it. Currently work full time as a laboratory manager at a pharmacy here, and then attend my local church called Christ Community Church.
Awesome. Awesome. So, before we do get into the questions, though, it wouldn't be a Grace Alone episode if I didn't ask you, how did the Lord save you? I mean,
Wow.
what's your testimony?
Yeah. So born and raised in a Christian home, very blessed to just be in a place where all my siblings are saved. My parents are saved. My parents have been married. I think now they're going on 44 years. And I'm really, the older I get, the more I see that is truly a gift. So I was raised in a home that taught me how to pray, taught me how to read my Bible. My mom was a children's minister. My dad was Sunday school teacher, youth volunteer. So, we're always at church. From a very young age, I could articulate the gospel. I knew that Jesus died on the cross to save people from their sins, to bring them into relationship with Him. By the time I'm 6 years old, I know the gospel, but it was always for those people. I'm a minister's kid. I'm good. Like, God's going to throw open those pearly gates for me and be like, about time you showed up. When I was 8 years old, so this would have been February of 2005, so 7.5, 8. I was sitting, had just finished Awana. So it was our Awana lesson. We had just done all of our memory recitation verses. We're doing our Bible study. And Miss Ferguson, who now has gone to be with the Lord, she got up and just presented the gospel and explained how we all were sinners and needed a savior, that Jesus would not throw open the pearly gates for us, that without Jesus, without accepting Jesus into our heart, without being saved, we could not go be with Jesus forever. And I remember driving home that night just so quiet, because
Mhm.
it really was, the Spirit was just opening up my eyes to see that this gospel that I had said for years was for those people, I now realized was for me. I was somebody who needed the gospel of Jesus. And so we get home. I'm in my little bunk bed. My mom comes in just to pray that I have good dreams. And right there, I give my life to the Lord. I ask Jesus to forgive me of my sins, to be my Lord and Savior, and commit myself to Him. And I remember I just started weeping, and I shimmy down my little ladder, and I was like, Mom, is it okay if I feel sorry for my sins? And my mom was like, that's the point. That's like the whole point of this. And so that was February 2005. And then I was baptized in May of 2005, that same year. And that is what launched us into this amazing journey.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. So, let's get right into the questions. Like I said, there's gonna be rapid fire questions. I have these written down, so I think we've already gone over these a lot. But, um, yeah. So obviously, it's going to start is just kind of fire off a question, and then just ask you kind of give your opinion on it. I'll give my kind of short opinion at the end of each question too. But,
Sweet.
um, yeah. So let's start. These won't maybe all go in order because they're not really in a particular order. These are just kind of random. But so let's start. A lot of these do fall in the same vein. Would you say that regeneration is work that happens before or after faith?
I would say before.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would. I would also agree that that um, that 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 is also the case based on multiple different
Yeah.
scriptures that seem to talk about that faith is a work of God and not a work of
Yeah.
man. So
Absolutely.
therefore, that regeneration has to come before faith.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, uh, our second question. This is a bit of a difficult one. It took me a while to think of one. Uh, what's one verse that best summarizes the doctrines of grace?
I have been thinking on that for days. That was I loved that question. I landed the best I could really think of was I landed on Romans 8:29. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined. Nope, that's not it. It's 30. And those whom he predestined, he also called, and those he called, he also justified, and those whom he justified, he also glorified. You don't, you're missing some of the like total depravity is not necessarily, but also kind of is because we need to be justified from something. But you see where God's gracious election, and then only those whom God foreknew are those who are sanctified.
Right.
You do see kind of this the exclusivity of God's gracious choice of his elect. I think it kind of, and then of course you see this perseverance, this that God is promising to keep his people, that those who he justified, he most surely will glorify.
Yeah. As far as I was debating between the passage in Ephesians 1 and
Yeah.
also Romans 8 through 30. I I landed on the passage in verses, I believe it is, it's Ephesians 1 3 through 5.
Mm-hmm.
I believe is what I'm thinking of. Yeah. Actually 3 through 6. I take that back. No, it was 3 through 6. But yeah, I think that personally communicates the doctrines of grace the
Yeah.
best.
I could just, Ephesians 1 was what I thought. I was like the whole chapter. If I can just pick a chapter, I'm going to pick Ephesians 1 for sure. But yeah, those are great verses. I love that whole section in Ephesians.
Yeah. Let's yeah. I'm not gonna go all in order here. Some of this is just kind of simpler. Okay. Very controversial topic in our day. Somewhat. Well, it shouldn't be, but for some reason it is. Do men and women have different roles in the church?
Yes, and then I guess the pitchforks are gonna come for us now. I would say 95% of the time it is the same role. Everyone is called to minister. We're all called to love one another. These are given, to whether you're male or female. But of course, you and I think would agree the role and office of pastor, elder, overseer is reserved. And my professors, they'd always say it's not just for men. Like just because you're a guy doesn't mean you automatically get to do it. It's
Right.
qualified men.
Right.
Like you have
Absolutely.
to be called by the Holy Spirit to do this. But yes, I'd say because of that, you do have a difference of roles within the church.
Right. Right. s- yeah, no, that's a great I think that's a great answer. So, following in the vein of sort of our first question with regeneration, um, there's sort of this debate right now. I, I I personally think it's kind of foolish, but would you consider yourself Reformed or a Calvinist or both, or do you use those interchangeably? Or
Yeah, I feel like I use them interchangeably, which I
Mhm.
think upsets the Presbyterians.
Oh yeah, oh yeah,
You
they
know,
do.
they're like, I'm over here. I'm like, I like so much of Reformed theology, except like infant baptism and maybe some other things. I personally would say I'm a Reformed Baptist or a particular Baptist
Yeah.
because it's more than just Calvinism. Like if you read the 1689, yes, there is Calvinism in there, but also you do see more Reformed aspects as well. I would say Reformed because just for that reason, it's more than Calvinism. I feel like, but also at the same time, I'm going to use both.
Right.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
what do you say? That I liked that question. How
Yeah.
do you describe
So there would be a few aspects, and we'll head into a particular strain in my theology in a bit. But I would consider myself what was- so Sovereign Grace years ago came out with this phrase they called essentially reformed, and so that's
Yeah,
kind of what I would say. So
sweet,
I
amazing.
am I I would not embrace you know all aspects of things like the Westminster and things like
Right,
that.
right.
But and obviously the Presbyterians and even some of the 1689 uh, guys do not particularly like when I use the term reform, but I
Right.
would consider myself reformed simply because those who held to is a Calvinistic soteriology have historically always called themselves that.
Yeah.
And that term Calvinism isn't, it doesn't really show up in history a lot, but the
Right.
term reformed does, and I find
Mhm.
it more. So because of the fact that I mentioned that, um, probably should just go into this question next so that I don't leave the listeners hanging on to wondering why the 1689 people wouldn't consider themselves reformed. And so, what's your view on the gifts of the Spirit?
Oh
Cessationist or
gosh.
continuationist?
When I read that, I was like, oh no. I feel like I change every day. Some days I'm like, none of it. And then some days
Mhm.
I'm like, someone prophesied to me today. Um, I really I think I'm growing a little. Well, I don't want to say growing because we're all growing. I am moving, I think, in a direction to where I could see where the sign gifts were necessary for the establishment of the church and are not necessarily necessary today. Paul, though, he doesn't seem to, when he's writing in Ephesians, no, not Ephesians, First Corinthians, he does not seem to think they're going to end. So I go back and forth. I'm more on the I personally do not expect to see the sign gifts, but if somebody speaks in tongues in my church and a translator pops up, praise be to God.
Right.
Very open-handed with it, I feel like.
Yeah. So I am now, again, this term doesn't show up as much as it used to. Um, but I would be an open but cautious continuationist.
Yes, I
And
like that.
so essentially, is I would embrace all of the spiritual gifts as for today when it comes to issues like tongues. I would say that there would be, so when we have an actual human language, there should always be an interpreter. As
Mhm.
far as when Paul talks about the tongues of like a heavenly language and angels, where I would be open but cautious is say that yes, that's for today, but that's to be between, like, that's to be kind of a private thing between
Right.
you and
Mhm.
God. So that's where I wouldn't embrace this kind of just public utterance thing. But the reason why I chose that question second is because that's usually why the reformed crowd does not accept when I call myself reformed because of that difference in our teaching, which actually, um, if you look at these cessationists of the past, like John Calvin and John Knox, um, they seem to say things that are much more in line with the continuationism of today rather than
Right.
the cessationism. So these cessationists of John Calvin seems to word it like a lot different than John MacArthur would.
Right. Mhm.
And so I also think there are a lot of variants there, um, I would not consider myself on the cessationist side. But yeah, so that would be the strain of my teaching. But uh, another random question here, I suppose. Um, obviously, music expresses a lot of theological stances and beliefs. Uh, not everyone is going to remember a sermon, but they're probably going to
Mhm.
remember a song. I mean, I couldn't memorize the whole sermon, but I've memorized hundreds of songs. Um, so, um, what one hymn or song that you know of that best expresses God's sovereign grace and
Hmm.
salvation? So, if someone is like, and they're not going to listen to a sermon, but they'll probably listen to a song that you send them.
Right.
Like,
Right.
like, w- what would be your go-to there? You know what I'm saying?
I think my now if somebody. my age walked up and was like, "Hey, what would you recommend?" I have a couple of mine. My initial would be "All I Have Is Christ."
No, that's right.
Relatively new, so I'm not sure if it's like a, but I mean those words. I sometimes we sing it in church. I'm like, do y'all know what we're singing? We're singing that we're a bunch of rebels. That's
That's right.
crazy. I think it is one of the more beautiful songs written that really I feel like covers almost all the doctrines of grace, but definitely God's sovereign great just God's sovereign grace towards us.
Yeah. Um, of course, the channel knows this, but I'm a big Sovereign Grace guy.
Yeah.
Always gonna recommend them.
So
And but so yeah, no, all I have is Christ up in my list. The one I've always sent is one that's not really well known, but it was in Sovereign Grace's album on Romans, and a song they wrote on Romans 9 called "It's Your Grace." I think so. The first few verses go over Romans 9, and the last verse kind of covers a little bit of Romans chapter 10 as well, and kind
mhm.
of conflates the idea that uh, God is God and it's His grace and He's going to save who He's going to save,
Yeah.
but also, He's not going to turn away someone
Right.
who comes in faith, and so it does conflate those two. And so I would say that's the best song. But yeah, pretty much anything by Sovereign Grace. I think you're going to get some strain of the doctrines of grace
Mhm.
out of that because that's
Yeah.
such a part of uh, their their um, such a part of their teaching. So, big question in today's world, we got two sides of the reformed people arguing over this. We have people um, who say that. Oh, so I'll just frame the question like this. So, gospel centeredness.
Hmm.
It's a big
Mhm.
debate. It's a big debate in our
Yeah.
world, and I don't want to assume, but I would assume you would be more on the gospel centered kind of side of things as I
Yeah.
would. And there are other guys who see that as um, a problem because it leads to other things in their mind. But so a big thing at our school, that's like a big thing. That's like
Yeah.
being gospel centered is a big thing there.
Yeah.
So what does that mean to you?
Hmm. What does gospel centered mean to you? I mean, you got to have a good, once you can get a good, robust definition of what the gospel is. Gospel's, there's like 100 different ways you can define it. I think gospel centeredness is truly that the gospel is the launching pad for everything, and everything you do can then be tied back to the gospel. Which I feel like I'm, Midwestern, which is a biblically centered, gospel centered institution. You saw that where the gospel heavily informs even my Greek classes. And also, you have professors tying it back to the gospel all the time. So it has to be a thread that is constantly woven throughout
Mhm.
everything. I think there's many ways to achieve that, but I think if you lose that as an institution, well, especially I mean, like as a church, if you're losing gospel centeredness as a church, then your lampstand is on its way out. But especially as an institution, as a church, it has to be a foundationally central that the gospel is the center of everything you do.
Right. Yeah. So, uh, next next question here. Let's see. I have so many that are kind of all running together, to be honest with you. Um, okay. Another question about this. Um, if a new believer comes up
Mhm.
and asks you, okay, I'm reading in my Bible. Let's say they're reading in Romans, reading in the book of Ephesians, or really any other book, because it talks about this almost
Right.
everywhere in the New Testament. But if someone asks you, okay, I clearly see in the Bible that God talks about predestination
Yeah.
and election, but they're like, well, that doesn't sit well with me. By the way, little side note here to kind of frame the question a little bit better. This is something that I've noticed. The only people that ask that question are people who grew up and they got saved at a young age and
Yep.
went to like an all. And I'm not saying that those aren't genuine conversions, but the only time I've ever heard people have problems with the doctrine of election is when they grew up kind of a Christian, went to, forward, went forward at the age of 6 or whatever, and they're like, this doesn't sit with my free will. I've never met someone who came to Christ out of like the worst possible lifestyle.
Right.
Like,
Right.
like they know in their heart of hearts that's the only way that this could have
Mhm.
happened is if he chosen me. So again, this question is typically not going to come from someone like that. I personally, even in the world which I grew up in, which was very against this idea of the doctrine of election, it was a horrible thing to them. Those who came into Christianity later in life and they discovered this doctrine almost immediately accepted it because
Yeah.
so so. But say there's a Christian who comes up to you, very they're a new believer, but they also are hearing things that, they're like, this election is kind of a corporate thing or something like that.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, how would you answer them? What would you say to them?
Oh, yeah. How to define election? I think my initial just like one liner is it's God's gracious and sovereign choosing from those already going to hell.
That's
Those
right.
already dead in their sins. God graciously chooses for himself a people to be saved.
Mhm.
Um, and then you just gotta like, ta-da, there it is.
Right.
Of course, you turn to Ephesians 1. It's just there. And God, I mean, from the very beginning, has always chosen him for himself a people. And I think you're right. It is, I feel like so, and even me who wrestled with it for so long, saved at a young age, and always was like, no, I gotta have my free will, blah, 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 blah. And I think election becomes so much more glorious when you realize like how dead you were in your sin.
Right.
There was no hope for me. What is all I ever got? Like I had no hope that you would own a rebel to your will. If you had not loved me first, I would still refuse you still.
That's right.
Like you once you realize how bad your situation was, you realize how amazing election really is. I would tell a new Christian, it's God's sovereign choice for your salvation. And you
Mm,
are saved because God sovereignly and graciously knew your name and chose you.
mm. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's um, such a good way to put it. I like that. Uh, so a few of these questions were kind of repetitive, so I'm not going to go over all of them. I just had wrote down 20 because I wanted to have plenty of time. But I do have some other questions for you
Okay.
that you
Ooh.
kind of have. They're not too difficult, but okay. So in Christianity today,
Mhm.
kind of like when you look at the American Christian world or the Christian kind of social media
Mhm.
space, what do you think is the biggest problem facing that today?
Ooh. Oh gosh. The biggest problem facing Christian social media spaces. I think okay, this is I might get in trouble for this. I think the biggest problem is we have a lot of young Christians stepping into almost these leadership teaching roles.
Yes.
Um, you shouldn't be doing that.
Right,
You
absolutely.
should be being discipled. I love your energy. You should not be doing that.
Right.
You have young Christians just saying stuff. It's like, whoa. Um, not that degrees are everything, but you have people with very little biblical training teaching us as if they're experts.
Right.
That's fine, but then you get in people ignoring people who really are experts. You
Right.
know, and it's a free country. You can listen who you want to listen to, but
Right.
I think more humility would be good. And then also, I one thing, and I love getting questions on social media. I really do. I have told so many people though, before you ask me, ask your pastor. I think we are forsaking the wisdom within local churches for people to post a random clip on Instagram. Like,
Right.
yes, it might answer your question, but we can't forsake the people God has given to us in our local church. Your pastor is knowledgeable. Your pastor also knows what you're going through, and how he might answer that question might actually speak to you in a very specific way.
Right.
Or that 80-year-old sweet lady who's just sitting there, she knows more than any of us.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
we can't ignore our family that God has given us.
Right. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I'll say this, and y people on this podcast know I'm trying not to be too controversial, but I, I will not in today's terms. I don't like using names very often, but
Right.
these two are sort of out of the loop. So when people are very attached to these like young, untrained, passionate, but not very trained guys, um, I- you know, they may be fine now, but I would give it a time to see where they end up because,
Yes.
um,
Yes.
you know, I was born in the early 2000s, and there were two particular untrained young men who everyone followed, Mark Driscoll and Josh Harris. Um,
Oh, yes. Huh,
uh,
yes.
and uh, I'm not saying I'm not saying they were all wrong. I think a lot of what
Right.
they said was great.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
But um, one thing that they had in common, and they were two very different people, but one thing that they had in common was they were young, very, very untrained, and just
Mhm.
kind of the first thing, and just kind of look at where they just kind of look at all that pressure kind of got to them, and things like that. Yeah, yeah, I think if the younger guys would definitely, stop and kind of get an education and learn, uh,
Right.
uh, I think a lot of that problems uh, would definitely change. So yeah, we've covered a lot of the theological, but we haven't covered one topic, and we're running out of time now. So it's a good thing that I'm running out of questions. Um, but yeah. So next kind of set of questions. When it comes to the issue of eschatology,
Hmm.
um, do you see all the positions as kind of like these are open-handed issues? Like I can be at a church and disagree. And what I mean by that is I'll kind of give my position first, and then you can kind of talk on this so you kind of know where I'm coming from. Um, I am a pretty, I would say, not in my place. I'm a little bit more open to my eschatology, but I would hold to
Hmm.
an millennial
Hmm.
position. Though I would be fine going to a church where the pastor is a historic pre-millennialist. And so
Hmm.
here's what I'm asking about the eschatology. Obviously, there are those two views, and I think that those can be open-handed. But
Yeah.
when, for example, you have someone kind of where I grew up in a dispensational world, and so where that doesn't just affect your eschatology, it affects your entire hermeneutic, how you view the world, how you view politics, actually.
Yep.
Um,
Yep. Sure does.
and and uh, and then you have the other pendulum, which is the post millennial view, which also affects a lot of how you see politics, how you see the world running, what's your mission in the church, what's
Yeah.
the actual implications of the gospel itself. Actually, I think that there are some troublesome implications in that as well. And so, would you see that is just okay? That's in an eschatological view. I can have that as kind of like an open-handed, or would you say, nah, no, no, I can't be part of a church who holds views like that. So it'd be closed-handed. Like, where would you be on that?
Ooh, okay, that's a good question. Because I feel like historic pre-mill, all mill, and post-mill, ultimately do try to have a somewhat covenantal view,
That's right.
more or
Yeah.
less. Then you do have this dispensational view that just very difficult sometimes. I actually, where I attend, most of my pastors are more of a dispensational view.
Hmm.
Now, our confession of faith as a church stands pretty much just like we affirm the bodily return of the Lord Jesus Christ and a physical resurrection from the dead,
Right.
which is baseline. Um, so I'm pretty open-handed because I'm able to sit here and as they're explaining certain passages that I would not connect to Israel, I can just kind of go, ultimately, who knows? We have all these different views because it means that we actually don't really know.
Right.
There have been some difficult moments though where and like I would tell this to my pastors, and they know because I do make fun of like pre-tribulation rapture and stuff like that. Um, so I don't think it has to clash, and I think Christians can be open-handed. It does take a lot of humility though.
Hmm.
Like I do. There are some Sundays, if we get onto end time stuff at church, where I do just disagree.
Right.
However, it's one of those, I know the Lord has brought me to this church and my pastors love me so much. So
Right.
I will humbly just submit and I'm not going to cause a ruckus. I'm going to hold my views, they'll hold theirs. We'll go on. There's also a large all millennial population at my church. So
Right.
I'm not like, I don't feel like I'm crazy. And they celebrate all the views. They really do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but at my church in Kansas City, it was like all millennialists.
Uh-huh.
And sometimes that is really fun because
Right.
you're all just interpreting the scripture the same. I
Yeah.
think there's beauty in the diversity, there's beauty in the unity. But in everything we just gotta have a lot of humility.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, I think we all have our favorite people we like to listen to, preachers we learn from. What would you say is your favorite pastor to listen to, preacher that you learn the most from if you could choose?
Gosh, I feel like I'm outing myself. I don't really listen to a lot of pastors. Is that bad of me? Alistair Beck is fun because his accent, like that is just so fun.
Is that
I honestly listen to my old church in Kansas City. So it's like Patrick Schreiner, Tyler Green, a few of the other men there. Their teaching is always just so good. So that's one, but that's not like big name, and that's not like John MacArthur or anything like that.
mhm.
Um, really, those are kind of just because I'm not in the big. I'll listen to Albert Mohler, the briefing, but I'm not really listening to
Right.
his sermons per se.
Yeah.
Not because I don't like him, just because I'm honestly either listening to classical music or just not listening. But definitely love my old pastors. And of course, there's so many amazing people out there to be listening to whose sermons are so good. I had what's that guy in Dallas? He had the big church. I forgot. He coined, I'm pretty sure he coined the term Baptist-costal. That's gonna bother me. Oh, and I'm gonna get persecuted for not knowing his name. Everyone knows who this pastor is. He's younger. He like took a sabbatical. Anyways, I listened to him for a long time.
Hmm.
Gosh, that's really gonna bother me.
A
Uh,
younger guy. Well, yeah, I don't know who that would be then.
yeah, he did a good Revelation study as well. Um, it's actually interesting because my small group at church, we're gonna do like my little community group. We want to do a
Hmm.
Revelation
Yeah.
study, and they're like, "Well, let's find a pastor who's taught on it and like listen." And I kind of push back, and it's one of those like wisdom in the local church. We have pastors who have taught on this in our local church. Also, wisdom within our own community group as well.
Right.
So I'm more on the edge of I don't listen to that many pastors outside my own church.
Hmm.
Also, partially because I don't have time to listen to like an hour-long sermon every day. I
Yeah.
wish I did. I really wish I did.
Yeah.
And I respect those who do that because I'm sure my soul would be full all the time. But
Yeah.
I just don't. Who would you recommend though?
Oh yeah.
I'm always
Oh
down
yeah.
for
No.
recommendation.
So I would say that I'm never listening to anyone that comes out of my movement necessarily. I grew
Yeah.
up in the IFB. Um,
Okay, yeah.
so
Amazing.
I would have strong separations
Yeah.
from that for about 1,000 different reasons. But I would say that, as I probably mentioned with even beyond my music choices, my theological perspectives would come from, and a lot of our listeners will know this from listening to me in the past, but a lot of people who are maybe listening to this for the first time have no idea kind of where this is because it's such a small entity now. But Sovereign Grace churches, which
Yeah.
was so most pastors from there I'll listen to a lot.
Mhm.
CJ Mahaney is my go-to.
Okay.
So yeah, I pretty much anything by him I could recommend. I've never heard him say anything that I've actually uh, disagreed with. So CJ Mahaney, some of the other guys from Sovereign Grace. I listen to a little. I used to listen to John Piper a lot more than I
Oh
do
yeah.
now, but yeah, I used to listen to a lot of John Piper. But
He's so great.
yeah, so those are all our questions for today,
Amazing.
and but thanks for coming on, and I will see y'all next time on the podcast. Peace.
Thanks so much.